Hello, everyone, and welcome to part two of Churchill's Walking with Destiny, a run through of the Andrew Roberts biography. I'm joined by Dominus, as I was in part one. Part one, we looked at the formative years of Churchill's life and the beginnings of his political career, his early enterprise into the imperial endeavors, and then his moving across the floor from the Conservatives to the Liberals. And then we ended around the year 1910, 1909, 1910, just as he was beginning to launch the People's Budget and had started his relationship with one Lloyd George, his political relationship, that is. We wanted to spend a bit more time fleshing out the significance of that budget, because I think it was possibly rushed a little bit in our last piece. So, but prior to that, you have some amendments, Dominus, is it, that you feel should be addressed?
Yes.
Some of our conversation in the previous part.
Yeah. So I thought we covered Churchill's character very well, built it up to the People's Budget, but there were a few amendments. So, firstly, we were talking about the Boer camps last time and the British responsibility for them. So I was trying to remember what Roberts had said about them, and I sort of bungled the quote because I couldn't draw it from my memory. So here I have Roberts, page 80. What he said was that the internment of Boer civilians in concentration camps was initially for their protection in the absence of their husbands and brothers. It was only later that the diseases broke out that killed 16,000 of them. That was the piece of information that I was looking for. So that's the first amendment. The second amendment is about Forster. We talked about in Forster the imperial psychology, the difference between the way Englishmen act at home towards people from the colonies and the way they act in the colonies themselves, and the difference in contempt and the superiority complex and whatnot. So in Forster, and we talked about we sort of made the dichotomy between Kitchener and Churchill. Churchill being the more solicitous one, Kitchener being the contemptuous one. But in Forster, I wanted to point out that one of the characters actually does say that the soldiers are less contemptuous than the actual colonists, the inhabitants of the British colonies there. And Kitchener was a soldier, and that leads into the point that Kitchener was actually spoke Arabic flawlessly, and he actually knew a number of different Arabic dialects and was able to communicate with a number of the tribes. I'm not sure how close personally he was to the peoples there, but that certainly I just wanted to point that out because we implied a cultural distance that in fact Kitchener did not have the last time we spoke about it. And finally, and on this same point, I was saying that Kitchener spent more time in the colonies than Churchill, which is true, but Churchill. I said that Churchill hadn't lived in the colonies, even though we talked about him living in the colonies. Of course, that's I meant to contrast him with Kitchener, not to say that he didn't live in them there at all, but I guess that's what came out. So, in fact, he did live in the colonies, as we said, and we covered his time in Bangalore last time. So, yeah, that's all. Those are the amendments.
Yeah, so Kitchener was still the stiff upper lip, but perhaps there was a bit more of the cultural side to him. And we were discussing this before, and perhaps he wasn't as enamored with the culture in the same way that a Lawrence of Arabia figure would become later. But nevertheless, there was an understanding of local culture beyond mere sort of thuggish intrusion.
And administrative, yeah, exactly.
From an administrative or army maneuver sort of piece. Yeah. Okay. So we were on to the People's Budget and the significance of this People's Budget. And I wanted to open with this quote attributed to Churchill. It's on Roberts, page 127. "We shall send them a budget in June." We're in 1909. "As shall terrify them," said Churchill. "They have started the class war." And then basically from there, he means that the Liberals, would end this class war. That he seemed to think the Tories had started. And Roberts comes in and says, Churchill seems to have been impervious to the fact that it was his own class that was under assault. And I think this is a good way to get into where was Churchill's mindset at as he unfolded this People's Budget. Someone like Lloyd George it's much more easier to understand. I believe he was the son of a tutor or some sort of teacher. He had, this is Lloyd George's background, he had lived with his mother in Manchester, although he was Welsh and of Welsh extraction, in a more middle-class family. His brother, who was a Baptist, had influenced him in terms of a non-conformist, more liberal attitude. So it's kind of easier to see why Lloyd George would go ahead with this people's budget, which is the introduction of the welfare state, and the eradication, even more so than we've had previously in the 19th century, of the landed aristocracy and the political significance that eradication would have. I don't know if you have any idea of why Churchill, because I seem to think Lloyd George seemed to captivate him. He was a very good orator himself, and perhaps Churchill saw that great oratory skill or radical skill, and then was maybe swept up by it all. I don't know what you have on Churchill's idea with this, where he was coming from, this people's budget.
Yeah, well, I think that Roberts says Churchill didn't seem to be aware that it was his own class that was being, what was the word?
Under assault.
Under assault, right. Well, I think he was aware of that. I think that when he crossed the floor, he was well aware of what he was doing, and he was aware of what the liberal program could potentially be, and he participated in the emasculation actively. He was an active participant in the emasculation of the Lords, and really cemented the Commons' grip on the country. So I think that his view transcended his class. I think Roberts in that line, I maybe gets trapped in a bit of
his own class indulgence.
Like in the sense that he sort of implies that he's expected to stay within the ideological bounds of his class. But I mean, in Roberts's book itself, it's shown that he transcended his class quite a bit. So it's odd that he makes that emphasis, and it seems that Churchill was well aware. That's just my view on it. Yeah.
I don't think it's overdoing. I mean, Churchill specifies the words class war, the subsequent election. So basically what happens out of this budget is the Lords would never traditionally veto a budget because they don't veto things financial. But then there was this whole uproar of whether the budget, through its social welfare reforms, was actually going beyond the jurisdiction of being merely a financial exercise, and whether it was then falling into a Lord's jurisdiction to veto. I think in the end, then they veto it. And then out of the whole conflagration, Parliament dissolves and there's an election. And the whole election campaign is billed as peers versus people. So it is very much like openly done along class lines.
Exactly.
Though I'll give you credence, like there's a line from Clementine in it where she says, Roberts attributes to her, this is Clementine Churchill, says that during this time, 1908 to 1911, Churchill was completely under Lloyd George's thumb. But the quote itself is her looking back on the fact from like the 30s. So it is a hindsight quote. It was, well, if you had known that at the time, perhaps you would have addressed something to him and confided in him that this is where you believed it was going, rather than merely waiting 20 years to realize that you had known it the whole time. But I think what I see in the relationship between the two is that probably the two best orators of the time. And Balfour is coming towards the end of his regime. This idea of the Hotel Cecil, because he is the nephew of Lord Salisbury, who had been the titan of the 1890s in Victorian Britain. So it's kind of like these are the two most captivating men of the era, and maybe they're spinning off each other's energy, even if I don't think Churchill's not a radical that I think Lloyd George would become.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, with Churchill's behavior as regards Irish Home Rule, I know we'll get into that later, but he seemed to have certain. He seemed to. Well, okay, he wasn't a radical. I'll agree with you on that.
Yeah. So there's also in these chapters this he really does, by stoking the flames of the peers versus the people, brush up against the Tory diehards. I think there's quotes attributed to him that he was caddish and tactlessness in his speeches during the election of 1910. Lord Milner says of the People's Budget that it was, quote, our duty to prevent it, damn the consequence. So there is this, like, he's brushing up against this Tory sense of duty. Curzon as well attributed a quote from Renan saying that all civilizations were the work of aristocracies. And there's these group of Tory diehards who refuse to believe that this budget is sending them in the right direction. And it is fascinating that Churchill, like, naturally you would expect to find him on the same side of these people. I would have thought, but being born in the Marlborough estate, Blenheim Palace. Sorry, it escaped me briefly there. But between 1906 and 1910, these elections, right? So the new election comes in. Liberals lose 104 seats compared to their landslide that they had in 1906. Yet they proceed to go ahead with the budget, and I think that that's an interesting piece. I said this part of British history really bristles with me as like it's an unrepresented part of Britain's past, as like losing the imperial grandeur is this people's budget. It's not talked about as much as what people should. So despite losing 104 seats between your landslide in 1906, when you hadn't brought forward the people's budget, and the 1910 election, they decide to go ahead with it anyway. There's a second election that has to be called to break the gridlock. Right. And then they have to end up going into the Liberals end up having to go into coalition with the Irish Home Rule Party, which then leads to them having to pass an Act of Parliament in 1911, which says that if the same bill was presented to the Lords for a third time, the Lords couldn't veto it. And so, like, the Lords, what's the bill going to be? But the bill is going to end up being the Home Rule Bill.
Right.
So the People's Budget has unleashed not only the desecration of the old aristocratic ties that had kept Britain, and the Lords was the primacy of the Lords in a certain regard over the Commons that had remained right up to this period. It also then destroys or threatens to destroy the entire Union by basically giving credence to the Irish Home Rule Party, which is, if you go back to the landlord and refusing to pay rent agitation of Parnell, which had been this thing had been kicking on for decades. It was them going into a coalition that seemed to be vindicated the more rambunctious policies. I mean, there was murders in Phoenix Park of people who were brought across to be working in Dublin Castle as a lieutenancy of Ireland, etc.
Right.
And by going into coalition now with Liberals, it was seen to have justified all of these sort of acts. And we're going to see these sort of acts later, done first by repeated by the suffragettes when they want the votes for women, and then eventually what will bookend this part that we're looking at in India, right? The whole jewel of the crown. So for me, I can really trace it a lot back to this budget, and then leading to this Act of Parliament. And by
your view,
go ahead.
So your view of the People's Budget is sort of this landmark moment where the glory of Britain fell, or something like that. The glory of Britain was toppled.
It's almost more key. Well, it's as key as, say, the 1914 moment, really, I would say. They're part of the same. Yeah.
Right. And okay. And what about, do you think it's more important than the post 1945 reorganization?
Yes. I would. Yeah. I would certainly place, like, this is, for me, is peak. This is zenith, and everything subsequent is kind of like, we'll get to this, and we can see this when Churchill's chancellor in the 1920s. He's dealing with a Britain which is much more. It's difficult. I mean, his period as chancellor in the 1920s is seen as ultimately a failure, despite he being chancellor for about 5 years. But I think actually he's dealing with a circumstance there as chancellor which is very difficult to be a success. Whereas at this point, you've brought it upon yourself with the instigation of the People's Budget, rather than being dealt a rough hand.
I would say that the Commons although this was the act which sort of cemented the Commons' grip over over the country, I think that the Commons began to have a primacy or a primary role in British politics earlier in the 19th century.
It did, but I felt there had been a fight back from the Lords with the Salisbury and.
Oh yeah, no, there was, but I don't. I think it was headed in this direction. I don't think that title.
That's a very Churchillian
historical
view. when he becomes almost. I think Robert says this. There's nothing in Churchill's view during this period which is different even to Charles James Fox of the late 18th, early 19th century. This sort of a Whiggish history, the Macaulay vision of history. We discussed that in the last part.
Well, I do admire the Whigs. I don't completely support everything that they did, but I admire them, and I don't endorse Whig history entirely. But it just seems like look, Charles James Fox. Actually, that is an apt comparison now that I think about it, even in appearance maybe. But also Charles James Fox supported the American Revolution, and Churchill supported over his own government, and Churchill supported the Irish nationalists over his own government, and almost actually precipitated armed action against the Ulster Unionists. So.
Yes, well, I think we can. That is a good point to move on to that. Actually, I have a note here of Churchill's vision for Ireland. So, of course, by the time the Parliament Act had happened, they're in coalition with the Home Rule Party. So it's the Irish Home Rule Bill then gets presented. The Lords can't veto it. And so the Ulstermen start arming because they fear that Home Rule is going to happen on the entire island. And above all, Churchill wants to avoid this. His vision of Home Rule, he starts sending basically battleship cruisers, this is what you're talking about, into the Irish Sea. And he's ready. There's a report even from some French diplomat, or I think it's unnamed, it's unconfirmed, that says that Churchill was ready to level Belfast if it began to rise.
I think that's nonsense. I don't think.
Yeah. Considering the source is a French diplomat, I would be spurious. I find it spurious.
It certainly is. Yeah.
This is his vision as attributed by Roberts. So he wrote in December 1911, quote, "Not only to federate the empire, but to draw nearer in bonds of friendship and association to the United States." So this is where his whole idea of what he wants to do with Ireland is beginning to twin with his idea of how he wants to incorporate the English-speaking peoples as a whole. "The road to the unity of the English-speaking races is no doubt a long one, and we cannot see the end of it, but it is an open road, and an Irish Parliament loyal to the Crown," I mean, that's a pretty important caveat, "and free to make the best of the Emerald Isle is assuredly the first milestone upon it." His mind, Churchill's, was starting to move along the lines that were to climax with his suggestion of joint Anglo-American citizenship at Harvard in 1943.
Yes, I recall that. That would have been ghastly, but I don't think he was ever serious. But anyway, yes, back to the matter.
So that's the vision is federal, right? And in this sense, it's not really even that different to, we talked about Joseph Chamberlain's idea of trying to federate the empire or having an imperial parliament.
Exactly. Except
the devil, again, the devil is kind of in the detail, I think. Both would have agreed with federation. And actually, I was thinking about this because I admired Chamberlain a lot, and he's admired in certain circles where Churchill is not. And it's kind of like, well, why is that if both believed in this federal idea of the empire? And I think ultimately it is down to, it's kind of like the federation of the empire itself as a formula. This is like the Thomas Carlyle idea that the formula isn't going to drive something. What's going to drive it is the circumstances of the men who are, say you have a formula creates a House of Representatives or something. It's the men that then populate that house that's going to drive whether that was a success or not just the formula that created it. So the formula of federating the empire isn't necessarily going to fix any of its problems, but it's going to be the men who populate it. And again, we can lead this. I don't know if you have any other opinions on certain characters that come to the fore during this period where he's seen as a betrayer to the Ulstermen. But I'm also kind of captivated by the character of Edward Carson at this period. I don't know if you have anything to say on that.
I on the whole.
Or say Bonner Law has become leader of the Tory party at this point as well.
Yes, Law became leader of Law was a Canadian, was he not?
Yes, Law was another idea of how to incorporate the empire, because it was if they had a Canadian leader or a colonist as a leader of the Tory party, the Tories thought that it would be a better way to, if we can't have an imperial parliament, then perhaps at least we can imperialize the Tory party, so to speak.
Yes. Yes.
That was kind of behind the vision of putting Law in the leadership.
Mm-hmm. And he was, well, that's interesting. He also later became quite good friends with Max Aitken, the Lord Beaverbrook. They were both from New Brunswick. But anyway, as regards Edward Carson, I don't really have much to say about the whole issue of Churchill and his supposed betrayal of the Unionists, the Ulster Unionists. There was a speech that he delivered in Belfast during this whole kerfuffle, and there were fears that he could have been assassinated by some of them. I don't fault Churchill the way that the Unionists do, but I also am not quite as I think last time we agreed that Irish home rule was a mistake from an imperial standpoint, but I'm not quite as vehemently opposed to it as you seem to be. So I don't have much to say other than that. What about you? What do you think?
Well, the Carson character, I find, so there's two things, because if you learn about this period of history in Ireland, basically Churchill's acquiescence of the Irish Home Rule Party or any of this, that is not taught at all, right? So what he's remembered as later is basically because he's the colonial secretary in the 1920s when the Irish Free State Treaty is signed in 1921, and he's basically seen as the man who splits Ireland, in the 26 counties and the 6. So all of his movements at this point has done him no good. It's done as no enhancement to his reputation in Ireland. He's seen as a man who tore the country up and betrayed the Irish people. That's the Republican position. Carson is a man who is barely even, if he's dressed, it's he's almost thought of as an Ulsterman, but Carson was part of the old Anglo-Irish aristocracy, and he had a seat. I believe his seat in Parliament was from Trinity College, Dublin, and he was fluent in Irish and played hurling, and but he was basically just a staunch unionist for the entire island, and I think he accepted almost this Ulsterman persona when he realized he wasn't going to hold on. It was almost impossible to hold on to the whole island. He didn't go all or nothing. He decided to try and hold out in the north. But I just find that idea fascinating, that he wasn't this Ulsterman, but actually he was this man from Dublin who wanted to keep the whole island. And of course, his statue is in front of Stormont now, and he never even wanted a devolved Northern Irish Parliament. Stormont would have been an aberration.
So would you prefer to fully united Ireland then?
Yes, the whole. No. I mean, the union. Everyone, a Lord Lieutenant was perfectly fine, I think, in his idea. I don't know how well he liked Dublin Castle, because I think even Joseph Chamberlain admitted that the Dublin Castle regime was an anachronism. It was never going to work. It was a medieval style way to govern from the Pale, really. So I don't know but Carson, I just find like Carson is also this guy who he attacked Oscar Wilde during his trial, and he was one of the attorneys that helped imprison him. I think during the Great War as well, he becomes Attorney General for the United Kingdom.
He was the Marquess of Queensberry's barrister, was that it?
Yes, I believe so. So he's a kind of this fascinating. I find him fascinating. This kind of staunch man going up against the decadent degenerates of the 1890s, and then refusing to give Irish Home Rule an inch, arming Ulstermen. He's kind of this crazy character. Yeah, so actually there's this, we can lead this into what's going to happen later with Churchill's vision, because ultimately I think, whether you agree with it or not, how he sees the Ulstermen is, and the way they start arming, almost them as anticipating a civil war in Ireland, as revolutionaries. I think he calls them revolutionaries as such, and you can see the similar attitude. This is almost the fomenting of his attitude towards the Bolsheviks later, because it's seen as the ones who are arming and the ones who are going to instigate them and call themselves revolutionaries will be the ones that Churchill will go against almost naturally. We see this in his time as Home Secretary as well, right? Where he will is that where there was this Russian anarchist jewel thief in East London, and as Home Secretary he goes outside the building and says to like level the building and stuff to the police, and wasn't even in his jurisdiction to be in the place. Like, he shouldn't have been there at all.
He was right beside the police as they sort of fired at the people.
Yes, and he almost sorted out. Like he is like, again, his thrill, his want to go to the front line.
Mm-hmm. As he did in Belgium Belgium and did he do it in the Second World War? I can't recall but anyway.
The Second World War, it's more like being on the rooftops during the Blitz air raid sort of thing.
That's what it was. Yes, yeah. No, he always took a thrill in it. Mm-hmm.
So we can move on then to the war. There's this idea of like how bellicose was he, because then, despite with the whole Ireland issue, that's inconclusive as towards as far as bellicosity goes, because he was sending gunboats to the Irish Sea, but also he was against kind of a provisional, the UVF being established sort of thing was what his fear was. So it's I think he likes bellicosity, but he likes it to be done in terms of the pieces on the board, the grand game. When it becomes paramilitary, this sort of thing, I think it turns his stomach.
I think so. I think I concur there. Yeah.
And there was one I do think he was an agitator. So we move on to the chapter that Robertson titles. It's a quote from Churchill where he's like, "This war, it's a glorious war." I'm almost reminded of like that. Was it from the Mad Max? Like, what a lovely day! It's like, this is Churchill as the Great War begins to unfold. People talking about the horrors of it, and he's just going on about how
delicious war.
That's the quote. Of course, by now he's moved into the Admiralty, and he was seen as the man who got the Navy ready for war. So that's where the bellicosity, or his want for armament, his want for greater defense budget, greater defense expenditure in the years 1911 to 1914, can be seen as admirable.
It was admirable, and actually, as the First Lord. So one of the things that he did is he established a naval war staff and divided it between operations and intelligence. And he also changed the strategic focus from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. So he ended up pulling 6 ships from the Mediterranean and stationing them with the North Sea fleet. And a number of other. He was a great reforming presence in the Admiralty. He sort of jolted it awake, and as Kitchener said to him, I think after Gallipoli, whatever else they say about you, they can't take from you the fact that you essentially prepared this country for war. You girded us against the Germans before it was too late. So
yeah, because of course the establishment of the blockade in the early parts of the war are key to the eventual reason for German collapse on the home front, though it'll take years. But getting there quickly and keeping those ships blockaded in the North Sea was critical. I also will cast some bone here because, by 1911 there was the Agadir crisis in Morocco, in which he was quoted as calling the treacherous Germans because they tried to instill a man loyal to the Kaiser in charge of Morocco rather than one who'd be more friendly to the Entente. But the wider issue was, where was he in 1904 when the Entente Cordiale was set up? So I think antagonism towards Germany precedes any of his strong influence in the Admiralty or anything of this. So you can't really blame him for that. He inherited something that was already getting antagonistic towards Germany, and he put them into shape by 1914. There was also an interesting thing about, I was thinking again about this idea of you have positions, but the men who occupy the positions is what's important. And you mentioned the way you reformed the Admiralty. There was a piece where Roberts talks about the Admiralty used to be a position almost within the cabinet that you were simply reporting what the First Lord or what the Admiralty wanted to say.
Right, and it was
the Sea Lord. Sorry, you as First Lord of the Admiralty were just reporting what the Sea Lord wanted you to say to cabinet, and you were a conduit for that advice rather than having a strategy yourself. And he changed that. He brought in.
He did. He changed it, and because actually that's crucial. It's interesting because the Admiralty was formerly, as you say, completely under the control of the First Sea Lord. The First Sea Lord was the non-political head of the Navy, and the First Lord of the Admiralty was the political appointee. And so, what Churchill had to do was actually transfer that element of control from the deep institutional structures of the admirals directing everything, the lifelong Navy men, to politicians. And he actually saw, contrary to what people might say in the present day, he thought that the admirals were less competent than the politicians. And I suppose maybe, at least in his particular case, he made a lot of mistakes, but I think on the whole it was proven, because although the admirals had a greater sense of caution, and maybe their caution avoided certain disasters that Churchill would not have foreseen, they were also extremely soporific. They just and slow moving, and they had no sense of what was needed to be done when. And so I think this establishing political control over the Admiralty was critical, and I think Churchill was one of the few men that could actually effect such a coup successfully.
Yeah, it's interesting you call it a coup. Interesting choice. I suppose it is, and there was isn't there even those who would say that in the May 1940 could be seen as almost a coup, where he lined himself up so that, now this is again, I think Roberts bites back at this, that basically he positioned himself so that Chamberlain would take the blame in 1940, and that he would have to be the one to whom they relied on for the premiership. But he was whether or not you could call it a coup or not.
That was the thing with Halifax and him in the room, right? Was that what you're referring to? And then and then Halifax was the one expected to take it. But there are some people that say that Halifax was, he declined politely, and he expected Churchill to decline as well, so that then Chamberlain would ask him again. But then Churchill decided to seize the opportunity. Is that sort of what it?
Yes. Well, I think we can go into more detail on that at a later point. But what I'm saying here is this is him getting used to realizing how you can do this, how you can be more dynamic in these situations. And as you say, that passivity of a Halifax at that moment is could be seen to the sort of passivity that these Sea Lords would have been doing here. Churchill seizes the active role as First Lord of the Admiralty rather than accepting the passive expectation that he would have had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we're in the July crisis. I actually have a quote here of him. I also noticed, though, okay, so the points at which he's saying, I'm happy, I'm so happy, this delicious war, etc. He's always talking to women at dinner parties. And you wonder what point of this is him just the drink is starting to talk. And he's
he wasn't a drunkard, but I see what you're saying there. It's funny. Was it Violet Asquith that he said this to constantly?
The delicious war quote, I believe, was, but then also on the midnight 28th July, Churchill wrote to Clementine, "My darling, one beautiful," it reads, "Everything trends towards catastrophe and collapse. I am interested, geared up, and happy. Is it not horrible to be built like that? ? The preparations have a hideous fascination for me. I pray to God to forgive me for such fearful moods of levity."
Oh, wow.
And then it closes with, "We all drift on a kind of dull, cataleptic trance, as if it was somebody else's operation."
But I think Roberts also emphasizes that Churchill was not a, okay, I don't know if you agree, but Roberts emphasizes that Churchill wasn't a warmonger, and the reason he says that is because I think, if I'm not sure if it's in that same passage that you read, but there was one passage that's constantly quoted by people who want to emphasize that Churchill was a warmonger, and he just took delight in, as you say, bellicosity. But in one of the passages where he goes on about the greatness of war, he also talks about how the whole damn thing could have been avoided had the monarchies of Europe acted more like monarchies and followed the dictates of statesmanship. He wasn't actually, although he was excited now that the war had started, he wasn't hoping for the possibility of peace to be eliminated before the war started. I think that's a distinction. I mean, unless you see it differently, but that's what I agree with Roberts on that.
Yeah, I think I'm a bit more towards the idea that there is a part of him that wants this, and certainly once it happens, there can also be that part of him that doesn't. That's the whole point of these streams, really, is to flesh out a proper a man in Churchill. That's probably, once you go into this level of detail, I think you do end up with a man who's slightly hypocritical even within himself, depending on his moods. And
yeah, well, there's the rationalist and the romantic, I suppose. The romantic in him was that, the Byronic impulsions towards war, but I don't think that. I think if there had been a possibility of peace, I don't think he would have actually attempted to nix that possibility or nip it in the bud or something if he had the power to.
No, well, yeah, if he had the power to, I don't know. That's an interesting conjecture. But actually, you notice that this point between the rational man and then the Byronic idealist. Even early on, we see that. You talked about how he was quick to get the blockade on Germany. He also predicts, I think, within days what date there would be this decisive battle on the outskirts of Paris, which ends up being the Battle of the Marne.
That was in his story.
That's the rationalist part. But then the Byronic part, even in these early days, is he tries to go to Antwerp to stop the Germans from seizing it, even though it's basically with a ragtag contingent, and there was never any hope of them. So it's a complete waste of time to try and say that you would go over to Antwerp and stop the city from being seized.
Well, their intervention kept it under Allied control for a fortnight more, didn't it?
Well, there's the position that they allowed to get more of the basically Belgian refugees were able to escape German occupation because of it, but also was the whole endeavor from a grander strategic reason a waste of time and operations. Also, was it early on? I noticed Battenberg resigns as Sea Lord. Roberts tries to say this isn't because he was German, but then goes on to say it's kind of because he was German. So Battenberg was born in Germany, and he was the Sea Lord of first Sea Lord. But he wasn't just German. He kept an entirely German staff. So everyone thought he was basically going to be a spy, or at least some of his staff would be a spy. He would be negligent to spies.
If not a traitor, then uncomfortably close to the enemy. Yeah, I guess.
And then what ends up happening is replacement becomes Lord Fisher, who's the 73-year-old, and it's Lord Fisher with Churchill who will help to try and come up with this the famous Gallipoli Campaign in 1915.
Now, Roberts largely casts Fisher as an incompetent. But
at 73 years old, I do kind of wonder how lucid was this man.
Well, I mean, but Churchill conducted the Second World War in his 60s, didn't he? But I think, and his second premiership was when he was in his 80s, although he was losing his mind at that point, his memory. So anyway, but Fisher, I think Robert says this is one of the few personnel decisions. Churchill made this personnel decision. And I think he says it's one of the few personnel decisions that Churchill made that was ill-advised. At least that's Robert's opinion. But he also, Fisher had legitimate accomplishments, but generally he's cast in this biography as an incompetent. So I just
What I was struck by, like, rereading it, is this him wanting to completely flip the lid now? He had gone into the Admiralty expecting to be in the passive position, and now he almost tries to find somebody who's going to be a yes man almost for him in the opposite seat.
Right.
I think there is a possibility there of this happening. Now, the idea of the Gallipoli itself, we can get into this. I think there was pressure. So as Robert said, on the 2nd of January 1915, Grand Duke Nicholas, head of, I believe, I'm not sure now if it was the Navy. It was, anyway, a large part of the Russian imperial forces. He urged Britain to undertake a diversionary attack, which would alleviate some of the pressure Russia was under, because, of course, the whole Great War campaign for Russia is just, bar a brief Brusilov offensive in 1916, is just a constant disaster. So they were actually getting urged by Russia to do something. And, of course, in October, the Ottomans had come in on the side of the Germans. The Germans had immediately given them warships, and they had gone up into the Black Sea with those warships and attacked Sevastopol and Odessa, important Russian ports. So that, I think that the entering of the Ottoman Empire in late, by which point Churchill has already conducted himself well in the North Sea.
Yes.
Then, in conjunction with the plea from Russia, I think means the undertaking of a campaign, not necessarily in Gallipoli, but a campaign in the Eastern Mediterranean, for me, doesn't necessarily read as a stupid idea. I don't know what your thoughts on, like, was going in at all a stupid thing, or was Gallipoli. Was it lost in the detail?
Well, no. Okay, so the strategic rationale behind Gallipoli was that if an Allied fleet, right, managed to dislodge Ottoman forces right at the Straits, the Dardanelles Straits, and then enter the Sea of Marmara and topple Istanbul through a naval, and I think they were also a naval and a land coup. So I think it was the Navy that was supposed to enter through the Straits, and then they were supposed to have an accompanying force on the side, if I recall correctly. I know there were a number of strategic ructions. They kept going back and forth. Should we have an accompanying land crew? Should we not? But the idea was that if they managed to topple Istanbul, then it would prompt a bunch of rebellions in the Baltic states over which the Ottoman Empire had control, and that could potentially knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open up a passage through which they could send supplies to Russia, who, as you say, needed their help. So that was the strategic rationale. Was it stupid to go in, considering the fact that the Dardanelles Straits were extremely well guarded by Ottoman forces? There were towers, there were water mines.
Robert says here that the Turks, so there's this idea that if it could have succeeded, it had to be done very quickly. And of all people, I think Fisher suggests a combined operation attack, which Kitchener is urging, I think, also. Because Kitchener tries to dissociate himself from it when it's a complete failure. But before it's simply a naval attack, he is interested in it. Being more a man of the War Office, right, to Churchill's Admiralty. But Fisher says, we attack in February. But Churchill delays it to March as a solo naval attack. Again, maybe that's just being overly confident in your own abilities, wanting the prestige yourself too much. But by then, the Turks had already laid 350 to 400 miles, mines in the strait. And the strait itself, as Robert says, for 41 miles or something, the strait is only 4 miles wide. So that seems to me like, if that's home advantage for somebody, that seems like a proper... it's almost like a Thermopylae of the sea to try and get through there.
It was certainly, the idea that it would succeed was maybe a tenuous one from the start, but I think that if they'd gone through with the with the combined forces operation rather than purely a naval strike, it could have. I think that it was rational. And Clement Attlee, who was a soldier at the time, who participated in the Gallipoli campaign, said that, we, like Churchill's, that although it was a failed stratagem, it was essentially the only original idea that the government, the people overseeing the war, conceived during that entire stretch of 4 years. Like it was a badly managed war generally by the British government, and this idea was the one idea that seemed to offer, a chance of that seemed to indicate to the soldiers and to the soldiers participating in the attack that the Allies could pull off a fully successful conclusion by the end of the war. And so Attlee and a number of other politicians who were all soldiers and who later had to collaborate with Churchill during the Second World War had a great respect for him because of this strategy, even though he was condemned for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point you make. Like the imagination was one thing on other behalfs. Ultimately, I think to do purely naval on that basic restriction, without being a military historian and properly going into it, that does seem like it. When you have the home, they did. I think they underestimated. They viewed the Ottoman Empire as a crumbling empire that would possibly give up, basically the same way they'd seen them give up possessions over the prior 40 years. Slowly a loser in war. But this is you're striking at the heart of something here. It's different, right? It's different. It's as if you go straight to London, you're going to find more resolve, and you could argue that in the Second World War. And it's also, this plays into a part of Churchill. I don't know if he learned this as a lesson from Gallipoli, but later we see when the Germans have their spring offensive, Churchill seems to believe that they shouldn't have gone for the spring offensive on the Western Front, but it should have focused on knocking out the small allies around them, such as you basically get a closer up through the disintegrating Italians. The Italians were close to buckling at that point, and a greater solidification again on the Balkans for Germany rather than go for France. Similarly, Robert says he adopts this strategy in the Second World War when, despite the Americans wanting him to go for the throat for Germany, he decides to. He's one of the strongest advocates for the Mediterranean campaign and to conquer up through Italy. He seemed to grow this belief of actually taking out the weaker allies first. I don't know if that came from Gallipoli. Perhaps he felt, that Turkish defiance that had occurred there might have stayed in his mind to change his idea of how you actually demoralize a people in terms of war. Right? That's just a brain thought. I've never seen that written anywhere else, that it was like him learning a lesson from Gallipoli. But
exactly. Well, he did learn a lesson from Gallipoli. One thing that he learned from that disaster was never to defy the Joint Chiefs of Staff when they were all united against him, which I think he might have done in this case. I think that he was a lot more belligerent with regard to strategy than he eventually became. Although, that arrogance never wholly left him. Now, I think earlier I meant to say, I'm not sure if I made this error, but I meant to say Balkan states. I think I may
yes. Sorry, I should have corrected you on that, but I felt it was self-evident. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's a slip of the tongue. It happens.
I just remembered.
Yeah, so by May, so the whole actual Gallipoli operation runs from March to November 1915, but Churchill is kicked out by May of his position, And I think there's a more front office leaving in November. And so by the end of the year, he gives a sort of departing speech to the House of Commons and then joins the Western Front. Again, this want to just go to the front line. And he said, we talked about the poetical side. I actually just want to get this out first. There was I believe there was a poet who died on the way to Gallipoli just before it. Let me see if I can get it here. So on April 23rd, the poet Rupert Brooke died of sepsis from an infected mosquito bite on his way to Gallipoli a month before another friend, Julian Grenfell, was also killed. Churchill had wrote this sort of obituary to him, or some sort of commemorative telegram. I'm not sure exactly how the message was received, but basically he was trying to write something of the guy himself. And Brooks had a pagan sympathy of mind and body, and he changed this to classic sympathy of mind and body. And for that just sort of a pagan, perhaps he didn't want the man's reputation to be soured, and he changed it to classical. This is, for me, is like the sympathy to the poet, and he almost maybe was thinking about the poetical side of himself. And then when he's ousted only a month later in May, for the rest of his life, he has this, he hates May as a month. It's this month which hangs over him in disgrace, which again is I find that all very poetical. So it's interesting, even amidst this disaster, there are things which are happening, which are affecting him from a side not at all strategic, really, but quite emotive.
Did he really? He hated May. May was the month in which he ascended to the premiership, was it not? 1940, May 1940.
But in these passages in Gallipoli, Robert states that he always hated May. Now, perhaps he said that before.
No, I'm sure he said it before, but that's just I'm sure
because he lost his position in the Admiralty, and it reminded him of Gallipoli too much. Yes.
I know. I was trying to point out that it's interesting that he had a particular hatred for the month, and that was the month in which he ascended to the premiership.
Yes. Yeah. It is also May 1915 is also the month in which the Lusitania sinks. Wilson doesn't go into war then, though it'll take another 2 years because of internal American politics before they do go. I remember Churchill was quite upset that Wilson didn't have the courage to enter America into the war then and there. But once they'd entered, he was on the Western Front. I don't know if you have anything important to say that. I know, again, from the poetical side, when he's on the Western Front, he's dialoguing with the likes of Siegfried Sassoon. And I just found that sort of stuff interesting. Do you have anything to say of his time on the Western Front before the Americans kind of come in and the war is seen as the German collapse is seen as an inevitability? I mean, I already mentioned his take on the German Spring Offensive.
Yes, Churchill. Well, he was very much admired by when he first came in. I think there were some soldiers who had some disapprobation of him, but gradually he came to be very greatly admired as a captain or as a commander. And on the Western Front was when he was nearly killed. He had a bullet. This seems to happen to him, as we said last time, quite a bit throughout his life. Whiz by him within an inch of his face or something like that, which was something that he predicted of himself in his story that he wrote all those years ago about a war between Russia and Great Britain. Was it a fictional state? But anyway, but other than that, no. Nothing else.
And so by the time the wars ended, I was actually going back through this. I was interested in, actually, there is some stuff I want to say here about Gallipoli, and because of course in 1916 Kitchener drowns, and that ends a certain relationship that Churchill had in his life.
Oh right, he drowned in a ship that was headed for Russia, wasn't it?
Was it headed for Russia? It was sunk by a mine in the North Sea, and his body was never found. I mean, that's what I remember. But as it was happening, Churchill was working on a defense to an inquiry of the Gallipoli Campaign. in which he was said to that he was going to basically, for his defense, was going to try and attack Kitchener for incompetence.
Right.
And then it was basically, once he was dead, that was it. You can't attack the war hero.
Nope.
But also, shortly after, this is summer 1916, the Somme occurs. And the fatalities in the Somme are so much compared to the Gallipoli campaign that that I think basically it kind of means that this inquiry against Churchill it's not going to be as heavy as it once was, really. Well, like, once the level of deaths of the Gallipoli campaign begin to pale in comparison to the Somme. I have it here. The Somme, which began on 1st of July 1916, was to exceed in the number of Allied casualties in the first 3 weeks that of the whole 8-month Gallipoli campaign. So I think really once that has happened, this inquiry, he doesn't have to go after Kitchener, but his incompetence or his strategic blunders around Gallipoli or otherwise should be put into context with what occurs later. And of course, he's also against Passchendaele, and by 1917, he's very much against these these unnecessary offensives that don't have any new sense of strategy or ingenuity to them. And he's writing like treatises on how to be more mobile, I think, and he's interested in the tank warfare, which begins by the end of the war. So again, I thought that was an interesting observation, that one, you should place it into context. Two, he was against further offensives without any new strategy, a la Passchendaele, a la Arras, and all these battles of Ypres. And also, but in 1916, you have the Battle of Jutland, and Jellicoe comes in as first Sea Lord. I think him and Churchill do not get on well. But it's, as an indecisive battle, it kind of showed that it wasn't just the man Churchill and the place Gallipoli that was the problem. It was the war itself would not be a war in which there would be the decisive sea battle. That simply wasn't the way, between the numbers, between the two sides, between the types of armaments each side had. It wasn't set up for there to be a decisive sea battle, similarly to how perhaps he would have dreamed about in the Napoleonic side.
One thing he set up as First Lord of the Admiralty, he set up the embryonic organization that would lead to the Royal Navy. Do you recall the year?
Well, no. Well, I know. Well, he's gone from the Admiralty, isn't he, by May 1915? So it must have been before that.
Yeah. Yes, and he, and it was initially. They were initially. Sorry, not the Royal. Slip of the tongue. Royal Air Force.
Air Force. Yes. Sorry.
Jesus. The Royal Air Force. Yes. I knew there was something confusing about what I had said. But the Royal Air Force was initially a small platoon or something like that of craft within the Navy itself. And another thing was that he also set up the Room 40, which was the signals intelligence. The intelligence organization that would lead to the development of MI5 and all those other organizations, which ended up spying on him in the 1930s. Those are two things, other critical things that he did during his time.
Yeah, it is interesting. He does seem to be more, despite always being lambasted, especially once the war is over, he begins more and more to be seen as the mid-Victorian politician swimming amongst people who are moving in a different tide. We see this certainly once the elections start pouring in after the war, and the Labour Party starts coming more and more to the fore. They try and cast Churchill as the anachronistic character, but actually through things such as what we've said, particularly around warfare, he's very forward-looking about like what can be perceived as fields of battle going forward. And I think that's an interesting avenue of his character. What I wanted to say then, what leads us into the post-war world, really, for me, is Asquith in 1916 fails basically largely because I think it's the Somme and it's the fact Jutland didn't quite work. By December 1916, Lord George and Bonar Law resign in the coalition cabinet, and then basically it's a means that forces Asquith's own resignation, so Lloyd George can become prime minister himself. And what you begin to see in 1916 is the ascendancy of Lloyd George, the same sort of ascendancy which he had begun with the People's Budget some years earlier, of a much bigger state, a centralized state, a management state. It's needed in the war, but it suits a character like Lloyd George, who always envisioned this of the state to grow into this big, all-encompassing managerial entity. And then once the war is over, the Bolsheviks, right, are in power in Russia. Now, there is a whole civil war to be fought in Russia between the years 1918 and 1922. And I noticed that very early on, there's Churchill says the policy should now be to kill the Bolshevik, kiss the Hun, basically make peace with Germany as quickly as possible. Yeah. This goes against the idea that he was always anti-Hun, anti-Teuton. That's the kind of expression I was looking for there, rather than the more derogative. Now, I still think there are points at which he is skeptical more of Germany than he should be, compared vis-a-vis Russia. Perhaps that's in the 1930s, and we can get to that. We can flesh that out later. But there is this moment here in 1918, 1919, where he seems to want to make peace with Germany and realizes that it's going to be Bolshevism that's going to be on the rise now.
Oh yeah, no, okay, so he was actually he was vehemently opposed to Bolshevism when it first arose. And he was always opposed to it, although he made some practical decisions later on in the Second World War. But
yes, because all this is going to feed into where the pieces are gonna be on the board in front of him in 1940 as well. We have to keep that in mind.
Oh yeah, no, it is. But he was a strong advocate of Britain's activities in trying to prevent the communists from cementing their hold, although and sort of their the presence of British spies and British support for the White Russians. That was the group name, right?
Yeah, the White Russians are seen again. This whole idea of like the White Russians, they're anti-revolutionary forces, but they're never centralized or a cohesive unit. They're more like regional detractors to the idea of the revolution, and who don't recognize the primacy of the Bolshevik government. I know there's a Denikin who seemed to be at one point the main leader of them, and Churchill was one of the last ones who wanted to leave. British troop presence was in Arkhangelsk and Murmansk to the north. Denikin was mainly to the south. This is where they had the White Russians had the greatest of their presence, was around Rostov and the Crimea. All the areas today where Putin's built his Kirk Road bridge, and there's the Sea of Azov out there. So the British presence in Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, coupled with, he also, I believe, kept sending funds to the Czechoslovak army that was out there. They were like prisoners of war who then began fighting against the Bolsheviks in the madness of the aftermath of the First World War. He would send funds to them and try and keep them in the fight in the Russian Civil War as part of it. But being forced to evacuate the British from the north, I think it is, whether it was only a small British contingent, whether they could have nipped Bolshevism in the bud here and there, right now and there in the early 20s. At least Churchill was trying to do that. By removing the Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, the northern wing, I think you allow the pressure, this idea of the Bolsheviks having to fight on two fronts, Denikin to the south and British troops to the north, is gone. So they can focus on Denikin to the south, and he loses his foothold fairly quickly thereafter.
Yeah, well,
I don't know if you had any other point on the White Russians. That's kind of where I see it vis-a-vis Churchill.
No, I don't have any further points on the White Russians. other than to add a brief point on Lenin, just to say that I think that what he's almost Lenin reminds me of a sort of in some how would you say it in the United Kingdom, a pound shop Napoleon, if you will, in some of in the way that he brought things off, and in his ability to anticipate events and sort of lead coups out of a very thin sort of base of support, was, it was admirable. But anyway, beyond that, um, and I think that many of them, I think Churchill may have underestimated uh, he had a great fear of Bolshevism, but I also think he almost infantilized it in a sense. In his enthusiasm for and actual belief that the Bolsheviks could be toppled. I mean, do you think that the Bolsheviks could have been toppled at this point?
Strangely, ultimately, no. The more you read about the Russian Civil War, the more you realize the whites were just simply too incompetent.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, totally. Operationally.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and perhaps like he wasn't in proper communication. I just think that when I was rereading it, and I'd never thought of the Civil War in that manner, of if you did have a proper concentration of British troops in the north compared to a strategic operation to the south, again, this can come back to things that the Allies do right in the Second World War, and that the Axis power does not do right in the Second World War, is the alliance between, say, the Japanese and the Germans in the Second World War is not on the same level of cooperation as that which is seen between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. Here, in the Russian Civil War scene, they're doing what you don't do as allies, right? What lines of communication really are there between Denikin and the British troops in the north? I don't think there's much going on at all. You do also have the old elephant in the room during this years with Britain, which is, of course, Ireland, which is, that's definitely going to take your mind off things like the Russian Civil War when you have this other, like the Irish War for Free State, and then the subsequent Irish Civil War. So
the Free State was established around this time.
Yes, all of this is happening right at the same time.
Exactly, but the monarchy wasn't. From the Irish perspective, the yoke of the monarchy was not actually removed yet. It was still a crown.
Yeah, that's more quietly removed later by a constitution.
In the 40s, isn't it? Right.
Yeah. So what sparks off the Irish peace again, of course, it was already going to spark off before the war. The war kind of puts everything on ice. But in 1918, there's a general election, and I was looking at this. Again, Unionists and Liberals form a coalition. And there's 73 Sinn Féin MPs and 25 Irish Unionist MPs are returned. The 73 Sinn Féin MPs refused to take a seat, and they set up a parallel parliament, a Dáil, in Dublin. And then the IRA also at this point started a violent campaign against police and government. And so it's not really until the Black and Tans start being basically too heavy-handed, and they burn down a large section of Cork, which Robert says, this is what brings over the bulk of the populace to the Irish Republican cause, when the Black and Tans seem to burn down like large tracts of Cork. And then this is December 1920. So like we're talking like right on top of the same time the Russian Civil War. June 1919 Versailles Treaty needs to be signed. There's too many things up in the air for Britain to have ever really done a good job in the Russian Civil War. Or perhaps conversely, they should have abandoned it altogether and focused on a better solution to the Irish question. Because he finally gets Michael Collins to sit down with him, and they sign the treaty for the Irish Free State in 1921. And then it's only like a month later that then there's the Ireland sends into a civil war, and there's the Irish the treaty. You're either pro-treaty or anti-treaty, because the treaty does not give you the entire island. The 6 counties will still remain part of the United Kingdom and not be. It's not the Republic of Ireland at this point, but it's an Irish Free State. So, and then by August, Collins was dead. So the one person, after all these years of agitation, Churchill had finally managed to get and by this point, we should say Churchill is colonial secretary, so it's under his jurisdiction to try and bring in these. He will be part of these peace process talks. But yeah, so you may have had with Collins, if you get him sitting down on a table, you may have been able to discuss something perhaps closer to Churchill's original vision. I'm not saying you would have gotten that vision of the federal state that he seemed to have in his head prior to the Great War. But once Collins is out of the picture, you've lost the only person you've ever really been able to sit down in front of a table with. So I think you've kind of lost there a chance to bring Ireland into your federal vision at all. And also then there's a series of elections. By 1922, Churchill himself is out of office. Yeah, carry on.
What was Churchill's role vis-a-vis the Black and Tans?
Yeah, this is I'm not actually. I didn't find anything in the Roberts book that said he sought them out to do like the scorched earth sort of policies. The Black and Tans were really, was it a Dublin Castle enterprise? I should probably know that better than what I do right now off the top of my head. I don't remember reading back through this, though, a large Churchillian involvement at this point. It was more seen as colonial secretary. He was seen to try and broker peace rather than being one of the instigators at this point. And I think ultimately too much of the Black and Tans was down to wasn't a lot of them men who had just been in the Great War, kind of sent back. They were a bit unnerved, you know. All of Europe as well is at a real agitation in this aftermath to the Great War, where everything seems so unsettled. Churchill even has a speech, I think, at this point where he says, you know, our whole idea and conception of what Europe was has changed, and we need to accept that in relation to the Irish question as well. See if I can find it. Yes, I have it here. In January 1922, Churchill managed to get the Prime Minister of what was now Northern Ireland, Sir James Craig, and also notably a member of the Other Club, which was a club Churchill had established to try and broker a cross-party outside Parliament discourse, right?
Yeah.
He got Sir James Craig and Michael Collins together. Sorry, I had said 21, I meant 22. Together in the same room, the Colonial Office, to negotiate the fine-tuning of the treaty and commending Irish Free State Bill to the Commons on the 16th of February. So on the 16th of February, he's trying to push this Free State Bill through the Commons. He argued that since the Great War, quote, the whole map of Europe has been changed. The position of countries has been violently altered. The modes of thought of men, the whole outlook on affairs, the grouping of parties have all encountered violent and tremendous changes in the deluge of the world. And more largely, that's what I see these Black and Tans of. There's this book by Adam Tooze called, it's a very good book, called The Deluge, and it looks at the years 1916 to 1931, not dissimilarly to the years actually we're looking at in Churchill's life. And that's what it is. The war doesn't end at the armistice. Actually, what happens is most of the imperial functions of war and all of the rules and conduct of war end. And across many parts of Europe, particularly the peripheries, everything devolves into a deluge, into more paramilitary style warfare, more what's the term? Militia style warfare, guerrilla warfare. Yes.
Well, yeah, I mean, okay, so hang on. So the Black and Tans were actually supported by Churchill, and he helped.
I believe but this is the classic.
He
him
helped
supporting
in deploying them as well.
But is he on hand? This is him thinking that they're more. This is like he's imagining they're more like the pre-war him sending a gunboat into the Irish Sea. But actually, what's happened here is the modes of man have changed, and he's sending like effectively wild, untamed men into a gritty guerrilla style war. It's right. Whereas perhaps in his own mind he still has this idea of the imperial sense of authority and discipline, which is not there. And I think that is a fault. We can definitely describe that.
It's interesting because before the war, when he sent the gunboat into the Irish Sea, that was actually against Unionists, and
yes,
and now afterwards.
Well, this is why I said all of his acts done before the war, none of that is remembered in Irish memory. This sort of Black and Tan operational stuff is more, and his idea that he carved up the country.
The Black and Tans actually, had an effect in defense. I mean, to construct even a tenuous defense of the Irish view, though I don't endorse it. Whereas the gunboat was just that. It didn't lead to anything further, despite the agitations of the Tories and the Unionists at the time.
True, but if you're looking at Churchill's character itself, both are kind of just deployments, right? And both are, but it's not certainly a misreading of the situation. And also at the same time, we have his. At the same time, Turkey and the Ottoman Empire has got entirely carved up, and he's he's also kind of idiosyncratic on this, right? On the one hand, he wants a strong Turkey, which he believes internationally can stand up to Russia and the Bolsheviks. But on the other hand, he doesn't like when Kemal Ataturk retakes the Dardanelles. Perhaps that's just like a prickly point of him. But technically, Constantinople was meant to be this. The capital of Hungary was pushed back to Ankara and deeper into Anatolia, and the Bosphorus Straits was meant to be this internationally monitored zone. And of course, that's lost. The Treaty of Sèvres is torn up by Kemal Ataturk, and Churchill laments that on the one hand, but then on the other hand, he seems to want a strong Turkey to stand up to a Bolshevized Russia. So you could say he's idiosyncratic on the Irish affair. He's idiosyncratic on this one as well.
I think his idiosyncrasy on these issues sort of reveals, despite the fact that his character is much imbalanced or romantic. I think it reveals ultimately a fundamental sense of balance, mastery of the situation, and ideological and psychological balance. I think it's admirable. I don't think it's hypocrisy. The nuance reveals it to be not hypocrisy, even though it might appear as such on the surface.
These early 20s as well, particularly 22 to 24, we begin to see the Labour Party. I think there's an election. So Baldwin becomes leader of the Tories.
Stanley Baldwin, yes.
Yes, and Bonar Law. It seems Bonar Law just like again we talked about this idea. The idea of him was this Canadian, and he would be this imperial. In 10 years. He seems to have he's not the character people wanted him or needed him to be at a very critical moment. I actually think Baldwin is kind of similar for different reasons.
No, none of them. The Tories didn't have
Austin Chamberlain as well, kind of dumps the responsibility of his father.
Oh yeah, they were all feckless ever since Salisbury. The Tories were horrifically incompetent and feckless, and their leaders were just awful.
I was looking at other ones. Well, so by 1921, I believe, Bonar Law is basically going to go into retirement at the age of 62. And we've just seen this is a world where a 73-year-old is the Sea Lord during the Great War. 62 is not an excuse to just head off.
No, not at all.
So it's kind of a strange, it's almost like an abdication. And he says in one of his like parting letters, like, oh, Britain should no longer be the policeman of the world. And he was brought in to try and consolidate the empire, and he seems to have just entirely within 10 years. I don't know if the trauma of the Great War, clearly has an effect on people, but he seems to have just given up the ghost entirely. So Baldwin enters,
sunk back into his colonial cocoon or something.
Yeah, I don't know where he actually retired to, whether it was rural England or not. But Lord Curzon is another figure who's considered, and I actually sometimes I read about this Lord Curzon figure. He's one of the
most respectable person, or what's the joke again? I don't remember. Anyway, carry on.
Well, he's of the old Tory diehard one. You think Lord Alfred Milner? You think you mentioned? Did you mention Leo Amory? Was it?
I didn't mention Amory, but yes, he is of that cast.
And I used to sometimes you think, well, if they had, because they were going to go for Curzon, and basically this is the era where Labour are starting to gain in politics, and the Liberal Party are fading, and Curzon is seen to be too much of the old aristocracy. We already had his lines on what he thought about the people's budget, and so he's kind of kicked out, and so. Not kicked out, but like he's not considered enough for the leadership. He fails to become leader. To I think actually, whether you like or dislike Curzon, I think he's a greater man than Baldwin, who becomes leader. But even if you think, well, they should have gone Curzon, they should have gone old aristocracy. It's kind of academic, because Curzon only 2 years later suffers some stomach rupture or something, so he's dead by 1925. So even if he had been elected leader, like fate had it that he was going to exit from the stage quite quickly. So you can't even kind of point to that. Even if it almost, this where we talked about in the first point, Churchill's destiny. The weakness of the Tory party begins to come to the fore here. And even when there are other options of the people who could be great men like Curzon, he gets this sudden illness and is gone. And is taken out of the scene. So that sort of stuff I find interesting. There's a string of elections. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe it's to echo a Whig historical point. Maybe it's all part of that only proves the destiny towards which the nation is heading.
Well,
no, I'm joking, but yes, I was thinking of William of Orange, and how when his ship was his convoy that was stationed in Hanover. No, it was the Netherlands. Anyway, the point is that it was blown down the channel to wherever they got off, like closer to London, where they were able to, and it was called a Protestant wind. So I was just thinking of a similar sort of.
Yeah, I'm okay with this idea of there being, like, when enough, something like the Curzon death and something like a strong wind. It is like when this force of nature grabs proceedings, things that are above and beyond the mere actions of man.
I mean, I
can grab proceedings.
I don't want
I'm not denying that.
I think I conveyed what I meant to convey. I'm not a mystic, I was conveying it as an ironical point, not as an actual. I wasn't trying to say that I actually believe that, the forces of destiny are working here. I mean, I'm not I was just saying, ironically, from the Whig view, this is what it would indicate, not that I actually.
No, I get that. But I do like it when sometimes when this sort of stuff gets embellished, but also not. Don't let it become overbearing to the understanding of events.
This is something that you would find in the, I don't know, like, Tennyson would maybe write about it, but it's not, it's not exactly a legitimate historical point.
Exactly, but it's I think sometimes like you need this element in your cultural setting, like your sense of self and where you are in history. It's good to have these beats that someone like a Tennyson can invoke. If someone wants to put, I don't know what was Curzon's illness, if someone wants to put his stomach rupture into verse, you're welcome to write a good poem on that. But yeah, so 1924, MacDonald has already been a Labour Prime Minister, first Labour Prime Minister, though it doesn't last long. But it gives this, it gives the precedent for later. It's under a coalition. It doesn't last long. And this is the classic. It's seen as the classic thing. The Liberals, by going into coalition with the Labour Party in 1923, I believe, had written their own death sentence.
Yes,
because the Conservatives had gotten the most votes out of all three. But the Liberals acknowledged the Labour Party as ascendant by going into coalition with them, rather than staying out and perhaps letting the Conservatives form some sort of minority government or something.
Yeah, well, I understand you don't have much experience. I mean, minority governments usually are not done in that in the United Kingdom, are they? Very often. I mean, usually.
No, well, it means a lot. So in Ireland, of course, there's it's not the first past the post. It's more a representation piece where you will always end up with some form of coalition.
Oh, is it a ranked ballot or something like that?
Yes, it's proportional representation.
I see. Okay.
So the Dublin Dáil is always a coalition. It's almost impossible not to be so.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's never quite as, I know in the Netherlands and things, sometimes they have like 6-party coalitions and it's crazy. It doesn't seem to get that point, but usually there is a major party and they will have to rely upon a small contingent, like the Greens, for instance, would be a small party that could go in with a more major party in Ireland, like Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael.
Mm-hmm.
But when there's a Britain minority government, it means the government is in charge. Their front bench hold the cabinet positions, but they don't have the votes to get through Parliament. So Parliament,
my point
it's always.
Is
yeah, go ahead.
In Canada, there have been a number of we have had experience of minority government. Usually tend to last up to 2 years, and it's a particular thing. But I know that in Britain, the minority governments, I mean, they tend to be avoided for whatever reason. The political process tends to avoid them, whereas in Canada, I know that we're not really averse to it. We just sort of, if a government wins a minority, they'll just form a government and keep going as long as they can, which is interesting. Anyway, yeah, that's all.
Well, in Britain, the mind is, if you form a minority government, you might as well start election planning, because you won't be able to get anything through Parliament, and it'll collapse, and there'll be another election.
Indeed. They've changed it. I suppose they've changed the rule now that it used to be that any bill that the government got voted down on, the tradition would be that it would oblige the PM to call an election. But now it's only on specific. You have to table the no confidence to actually topple the government, isn't it? Even on budgetary motions, if the government fails to pass a budgetary motion, they can technically remain, like before it would have essentially obliged the Prime Minister to sort of dissolve Parliament, but I don't think that's the case anymore. In Britain,
yes.
In Canada, it still is as regards budget, but anyway, yeah.
And it's, well, okay, so we're around 1924, and it is around this time Churchill goes back to the Tories, right? So we've seen this, like the Liberals signing their own death warrant, so to speak, by going into coalition with the Labour Party. He goes back into the Tories, and then we're kind of back to old debates we've had before, because you're in post-war Britain. The inflation is high, unemployment is hovering around 10% of the workforce, and Baldwin, to tackle unemployment, considers the tariff reform again.
Yes.
Which, of course, Churchill going back into the Tory party, but you will refuse to go back in under the auspices of a protectionist party, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what you thought about that. I found it a little vague. I didn't really find this. How did he come to settle with Baldwin here? Because Churchill will end up as Chancellor of the Exchequer. I suppose he was like, Baldwin was in the cabinet for far less period of time than Churchill would have been. So perhaps Baldwin felt obliged to give a large position like the Chancellor of the Exchequer to a man like Churchill for the sake of party cohesion at this point. Like Churchill's beginning now at this point to really be an old hand.
Churchill was given the position. If you remember, Lloyd Asquith gave Churchill the position of Home Secretary. Well, he gave him a cabinet position initially because of how dangerous he thought he was becoming, and because of how popular he was becoming. And
so, do you mean Baldwin here? Is it?
No, I'm talking about initially when Churchill was the Liberals back
under the Liberals. So you're talking about Asquith. Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Later on, and so Robert suggests here that basically the Tories had the same mentality. Like, he was someone you wanted in the stable. He was someone who could powerfully advocate for your party, and he was someone that you didn't exactly want against you. The power of Churchill's oratory essentially.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking. Yeah, in opposition, he could stir up the masses with yeah.
And so that's what happened. Although he left the Liberal Party before he rejoined the Tories. It's not like he went right from the Liberals to the Tories, because when the government fell, he then ran as an independent and then failed at that. And then finally, when he was elected to the Tory party, he hadn't even officially become a member of the party once more. He was a sort of an independent supporting the Conservatives. Then they gave him the chancellorship, and then he became an official member of the party again, or something. It was some convoluted thing.
Yes. Well, like this is we have to compare this to his original crossing of the floor. Of course, he has to quote, "It takes a proper sense of, was it ingenuity to re-rat? It takes a fool to rat, but it takes a certain amount of ingenuity to re-rat," or something like this was the quote he had upon rejoining them. But
that's about what
I do think that the circumstances of this are different to the crossing of the floor in 1905, where I said it was political expediency, and you disagreed with me.
I remember. Well, I said it was hatred of the Tory party, a small amount of political expediency, and
curmudgeonry towards the Tory establishment, Hotel Cecil, and all of that.
Well, I would call the old Tories curmudgeon, since he was a young man at that point. But yes, it's somewhat like that, and also principle. I mean, he supported free trade. He wasn't ever against it.
But
that was, but anyway.
A key, I think, so coalitions were quite rare around that time. I think this post-war period in Britain, there's so many elections. I think there's a 1922 one, there's two in 1924, or else there's two in 1923. I can't remember. There had been basically 3 elections in 4 years at this point, none of which had given, because you're at the period of Liberal decline, Labour ascendancy, but it hasn't quite happened yet. So there's 3 parties, and the 3-party system maneuvering around the first past the post system basically leads to quite an unstable period where it's difficult to actually form parties and form cabinets. So I don't think, like, this is, for me, it's far more understandable to want to add to the stability by being an old hand who had plenty of cabinet experience and going in and just cementing that cabinet experience. And as you say, then he slowly kind of gets pulled back into the Tory machinery, which is kind of like how the Tories, they're almost an entity unto themselves, rather than a political party for Britain. They're like
the most successful political force in the history of the world.
They're almost this protean thing, this pure idea of body politic.
They don't have any ideas. It's basically just support of Queen and country, and vague sort of hand wave toward tradition, and then anything goes. And it's glorious, really. I admire them more than anything. I mean, it's one of the greatest forces of modern times, the greatest force of modern times, I would say. The British Tory party. It's just magnificent.
I'm not sure I'd describe the word magnificent to the current state of it, but I get your sense of awe there from its sheer longevity.
They just swept the local elections and won the seat in Hartlepool. So I think they're still going strong, whatever you think of what they're actually doing.
Yes, they're going strong. Yeah, they they do. They know what the opposition is, and they know exactly how to go strong in relation to that opposition.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay. So he becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is quite an interesting position. Of course, it was a position held by his father, and there's this whole issue of the weight of Randolph Churchill is kind of over him at this point, because he's inherited the same position as his father. And as Roberts puts it,
and does he wear his father's robe in his investiture?
Yes.
Yeah. And his maiden speech or whatever. Anyway,
really? I thought that was metaphorical. No, but it makes sense, isn't it? It's just that the robes, the old dusty robes of the chancellor, like this would have been the idea, right? It is actually physically the same robes.
Mm-hmm. He also wore those robes whenever he was asked to give in his capacity as the head of the University of Birmingham or whatever university he was the head of, and whenever he was giving some sort of graduation speech or receiving an honorary degree.
Yeah, that's what I'm picturing him in. Yeah,
he would wear his father's exchequer robes, because of course he'd never gone to university himself. So they're a storied set of robes. Yeah. But you wanted to get back to his chancellorship. I'm very sorry. So,
yes, well, there's two things, isn't there? There's a general strike as well, which happens around this time, and he sees it again as well. I talked about this. Why did he go against the Ulstermen? And here he sees the people participating in the strike in a similar way. He sees them as like to be an insurgent, even to be participating in a mass strike, a general strike, is to also be an insurgent. And he doesn't care if you're a pro-unionist insurgent or if you're, in this case, if you are participating, if you're participating in an active insurgency, he sees you as an enemy to basically British civilization. Yeah. And so he does. I did notice this. He's treating the general strike as akin to a foreign threat.
But he was much more solicitous of the workers who actually participated in the strike than some of the other Tories who weren't as much vilipended for this particular, for how he handled it in a way that has been censured and criticized, lambasted, castigated, what have you, over the years. But he actually had a great romantic and I don't know if it's romantic, but a personal sympathy for the working class, and as proven by his by the people's budget and by various comments he made over the years. He was opposed to the strike and he wanted to crush it, but he wasn't this sort of anti-working class figure or something like that some Labourites presented him as.
Yeah, there must be something, right? Because this is a guy who's going to go into coalition with Labour during the war, and of course he manages to make the TUC, the main trade union council, call off the strike at the 11th hour, and I think only a lesser council goes ahead with it. So it doesn't have the same gravitas as it would have had otherwise. But ultimately, this period is seen as a failure for him, mainly around the gold standard. So much so, I actually forgot he re-implements the gold standard, I believe, in 1926. A year after all. So this is seen usually as a mistake, right? An error in economic policy. But as Roberts points out, Germany and the US had already reintroduced it in 1925. I think particularly the US introducing it is seen to be, Britain at this point is refusing to kind of come to terms with the realignment of global geopolitics, right? That the US is now the top dog. And the US being able to confidently return to a gold standard after the war, kind of, Britain needs to be seen in terms of pure keeping up appearances
in the same light.
Yeah, London needs to be the financial center of the world. You add stability by pegging your currency to a gold standard. The US have already done this. We've already seen enormous monies transferred to Wall Street during the war. So there is pressure to go back. I think there's genuine pressure to go back, staying on paper currency at this point. I don't think it's not in the mindset of of really any credible opposition at this point. I think in 1919, Keynes had written The Economic Consequences of the Peace, where he was upset about Versailles. So this is
was Keynes against? He was against the gold standard, wasn't he? If I recall correctly.
At this point, I'm not so sure. Are we talking Are we talking? Of course, he was involved with Bretton Woods later.
But when Churchill was chancellor and when he was considering whether to go back on gold, he had a meeting in Downing Street, which was a dinner between a number of economic experts, including John Maynard Keynes. And I'm pretty sure the majority of the experts advised that he go back, but Keynes was the one dissenting voice. But I could be wrong about that. I don't have I'm trying to find it here in the book.
So it's usually around the page 312 to 313. The Keynes part I wanted to bring in because his disgust at Versailles was about the structure of the debt and how it wouldn't lead to quick recoveries from the war. And we do have, in January 1925, Britain's war debt to the United States stood close to £1 billion, but £2 billion was owed to Britain by France, Japan, Belgium, and Italy, among others. That's not even including Germany. So Britain technically wasn't in as much debt as it needed to be, but you clearly have a cash flow issue here. And so you have two things happening at one point. You have high unemployment, and you have the restructuring of this debt. Now, going back to a gold standard would be seen to curb inflation. Sorry, you have three things. You have high unemployment, you have high inflation, and you have this restructuring of the war debt, which needs to occur.
Right.
If you peg yourself to the gold standard, that is seen to tackle the inflation question, but you make yourself less liquid because you can't just say ease your currency, devalue your currency if you need to make certain payments, right? So let's say, and this was was happening all the time with Britain, it was owing certain ports to the state, to the US, but then being owed more by the continental, as well as Japan here, by the continentals. Anything Russia technically owed was not getting paid because it had become the Soviet Union, and there's actually, interestingly, Churchill was opposed to reopening trade with the Soviet Union. I think it was still under the premiership of Lloyd George, and everyone else basically caved into reopening that relationship. But Churchill, despite the fact that trade was obviously necessary to try and get things back to a pre-war flow, Churchill still opposed it, I think, almost on ideological grounds. But so the Keynes situation, I think he was obsessed with the idea that the war debt was punitive, particularly on Germany. And I know Roberts himself is of the opposite position to Keynes, right? Where the Versailles wasn't harsh enough on Germany. Mm-hmm. This is the Roberts position. It should have been carved up back to separate states. So, for instance, like Bavaria just should have been its own state.
Well, there was either. I mean, you either had to implement Versailles to its. No, okay. This is what I think. Germany could have, yes, the Roberts positions, it should have been carved up, and I think that would have worked. Another thing is that if they'd actually held to Versailles, to the commitments they set out in Versailles, and actually vigorously also enforced them, you may not have ended up with war. And if you would, you see, because the thing is that Versailles was a touch too harsh, but a touch not harsh enough. And the people implementing Versailles were a touch too harsh and a touch not harsh enough, and that's what led to the war. And that's why they tried to find like a medium between it, and it just didn't work. But I think if Versailles had been properly implemented, I think that maybe they would have found that medium and it would have been effective. But I don't know. I'm not an expert at counterfactuals, but that seems to be my assessment.
Yes, well, it's a massive it's a massive can of worms you can open, and perhaps we can talk about it a little later in the next when we're into the 1930s, and you have the entering of the troops into the Rhineland and the lack of responses from the Allies and this sort of stuff. But with regards to Churchill's situation as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1926, he has these things to contend with. The high inflation, right? So you go back to gold, you can get rid of that. And things such as the hyperinflation, which had occurred in Germany, is probably looming on people's minds. Of course, England actually went through a great deflationary period, I think, in the early 20s. And what's going to happen here is they're going to go back onto gold, but ultimately the decision is they value the pound too high. I think they try and place it back onto its pre-war position with regards to gold. So it's pre-war value. And what that does is it leads to it being overvalued, and so British exports will then be too expensive for the world market. So, and I think there's the numbers here in 1921 in terms of tons of coal, because there's still very much a coal and fueled world.
Yeah,
Britain had exported 25 million tons of coal in 1921 compared to 73 million in 1913. So if you have if you make your currency overvalued, those exports aren't going to rise.
No, not at all.
So this is the main issue, I think, rather than the not going on to gold. And again, that's a political pressure, because the reason you go back on such an overvalued number is because you want to send out the signal to investment, to money in the City of London, that things are back to normal, right? That's the idea behind it. But yeah, it seemed to have led to the slower recovery of Britain right up to his chancellor, his losing of the chancellorship because of a reshuffle. I think which happens when the Tories fail to win back in the same. I think Labour get in, is it, with another coalition in a 1929 general election. This predates the crash itself. I think it's earlier in the year than the 1929 Wall Street crash. So he's ousted before that crash as Chancellor of the Exchequer. But yes, this decision on gold, I don't know where you stand on it. There's not an obvious quick fix. I think it's a very difficult hand to be dealt. And ultimately, the want for prestige shouldn't have overcome the realization that you needed to drive up exports more fundamentally. That's my personal opinion.
No, so you're ultimately sort of, if it's executed more effectively, you're in favor of a gold, at least a gold standard, or maybe a composite of gold and some other, I don't know, oil or something else together.
Yeah, actually, Churchill's interest in oil is again another quite forward-looking enterprise. He's interested in the new mandates they've gotten in the Transjordan, and of course he's part of the Persia oil company, isn't it? That's setting up in Iran.
That is Royal Dutch Shell.
Yes, is that the one that's set up in Persia? I can't quite recall. Perhaps it changed his name the odd time, but he's very
on behalf of Royal Dutch Shell, or Royal Shell, or whatever it was, called. Yeah.
But he seemed like he did have his finger on the pulse there. That this, we talked about the export in coal tonnage, but of course the coal society was going to slowly leave its seat at the top of raw materials. And I think he actually he had a quip on Baldwin. Baldwin was said to really have made his name in steel, in the steel manufacturing industry. And he had this, didn't he have this whole quip on, like, Baldwin doesn't understand raw material if it's placed right in front of him, sort of thing. That basically, but yeah, it's again this idea that Baldwin, although he's meant to again represent people that understood these interests, the steel manufacturing interest, how would you get Britain on its feet again in terms of exporting its raw industry? He was a man who wasn't actually aware of what was needed to do so.
Right.
Again, it's one of those decisions by the Tory party, similar to the Bonner Law decision for leadership, that they choose the wrong leader at crucial moments. Because we can say all of this Churchillian sense of destiny is leading to the hour and the decision, right? All my life was leading to that hour and that moment in 1940. But for me, there's loads of little mini hours occurring here, particularly in the years 1918 to 1926, when Austen Chamberlain's briefly leader, Bonner Law does the early resignation, Baldwin comes in. It's crying out for a better leader to seize the moment. And as you say, this is still the point in which you can decide to either implement Versailles correctly, or, none of this has gone too far down any particular rabbit hole at this point.
Right. It's still salvageable.
Yeah.
But it ended up. I was going to say okay, two things. So firstly, Keynes, I was correct. I found the page. He actually did go to that dinner, and it was Keynes and Reginald McKenna, the former chancellor, who both opposed.
And was it because of the fears over liquidity, over repayments, the structure of repayments?
Okay, here it is. Keynes' thesis was, which was supported in every particular by McKenna, was that the discrepancy between American and British prices was not 2.5% as the exchanges indicated, but 10%. So if we went back to gold at the old parity, we should therefore have to deflate domestic prices by something of that order. And this meant unemployment and downward adjustment of wages and prolonged strikes in the heavy industries, at the end of which it would be found that these industries had undergone a permanent contraction. It was much better, therefore, to try to keep domestic prices and nominal wage rates stable and allow the exchanges to fluctuate. I just quote it because that is a very good summation of the thesis, and that's from Roberts's book, quoting Grigg, one of the people that attended the meeting. But anyhow, yeah, that's what it is.
Yes, it's interesting. We have there the disgruntlement at the parity, I think, being key as well. You see, that's what I think. I think perhaps, it's like you could go into more detail on it. Would Keynes have accepted a reversion to gold at a different parity? Probably not. He seems to want to favor the entire open fluctuation of the currency against the dollar.
Actually, I stand with Keynes on this one. Oddly, I'm not really. I don't know if I'm just sort of a dilettante in this regard or whatever, but I support the floating.
The main fear is inflation.
I understand, but I don't think that. I don't know. I just accept Keynes's broader thesis, and I think that the floating exchange rate is much more conducive to and I don't know, a more a smoother financial system, I suppose. But I'm not an expert at this. Generally.
So is there anything after this period between 26 and the 29? Of course, we're leading up towards his exile in the early 30s. Is there anything that stands out from this point? I think other than that, I have noted is Chancellor of the Exchequer should be. He seems to have slowly won across the likes of Austen Chamberlain, who during this point Roberts references a lot as really. You see, Austen Chamberlain begins to be really taken with Churchill. He keeps talking about how great this guy is, a visionary. I don't know if that's just a radical performance, that sense of charisma that. Churchill probably possessed everything that Austen Chamberlain lacked. I just found that was an interesting period, that an interesting primary source that Roberts was going for, were these little snippets by Austen Chamberlain. Other than that, I don't really have much. Like there was a local restructuring of some local tax charges in 1927, which appeared to be a good thing he did in his chancellorship, but I don't really have any more.
All right, so then let's advance to his the point at which 1929 was it when he the beginning of the wilderness years, I suppose.
Oh yes, and this is where the position of India and the dominion status that is proposed originally, I think, by Lord Irwin, who's Viceroy of India at the time. There's, of course, Gandhi has emerged onto the scene as an agitator. We have had the Amritsar massacre in 1919, I'm going to say. India is beginning to have its march towards independence. Now, I don't know if you have anything on this. It's again seen as one of these things which Churchill was meant to have, quote unquote, gotten wrong in terms of the Whig march of history. Another one was his opposition to female suffrage. And another one was his gold standard decision. These are meant to be decisions he got wrong.
The female suffrage, Andrew Roberts almost presents it as a character issue. Like initially he was in favor, and then you had the sort of the shenanigans of the suffragettes, and then he's like, okay, I'm just going to oppose you for the sake of opposing you.
Yes, and we mentioned his how he would recoil at insurgency, right? These suffragettes attacked Asquith outside number 10. That sort of stuff would have put him off it, right?
It would put him off. What now? Was it really just? I mean, okay, I guess so. I mean, if it's just that sort of internal revulsion that could turn him completely, like from supporting suffragettes to not supporting them, I mean, it seems like a large enough issue that a slight character blip like that to reverse one's position entirely for a decade. But interesting, Churchill was an interesting figure.
I also have the quote. He seemed to think they had already had a certain vote on local issues, and he seemed to think they weren't getting involved. It was a throwaway quote he had. He's like, it seems to me that they're not interested. Because he was looking at like turnout on local issues. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, it's yeah. I mean, but then India. I think I do have some, like, this is something that I could cover, but I don't know if I can cover it in depth at the moment. We might end up with the same situation as the People's Budget last time.
Sure. Let's at least get the ground set then for the India Dominion status.
Yeah. So Churchill. This is seen as a fault of Churchill's because he opposed granting them Dominion status, but what he feared was that as soon as you relinquish control, the general relinquishing of control, which would lead to the process of independence. I'm not sure if Churchill ever thought that if it would remain a dominion in the same way that Australia and Canada were, or if it would, culminate in independence, full independence. But he felt that it was actually a local concern, which fueled a lot of his opposition to it. It wasn't only it was this. So the Muslim minority of India was sort of protected by the British Raj. They felt that they could coexist with the Hindus as long as the Raj was there as an intermediary force. And Churchill got that right. He got this observation right, which other people didn't get. And what he thought would happen is as soon as you remove that intermediary force, you're going to have this horrific strife between the two religious groups, which would ultimately be a great detriment to India. And you know what? He turned out to be right, if you look at what happened with partition and everything like that.
Yeah.
And if you look at Gandhi's campaign, Gandhi was seen by the Muslim element of the Congress Party as a complete fanatic. Like, they just thought he's a Hindu fanatic. I mean, look at this guy. He's an ascetic. Although at this point, I don't know at what point did he become, because he was a barrister at one point and he went to South Africa.
This quote, this malignant subversive fanatic, he described Gandhi as, which I underlined.
Okay. In what year was that? 29?
That's actually, what year are we in? 31. Yeah.
31.
February
okay,
1931.
So the Muslim element of the Congress Party saw Gandhi as a fanatic, and as well, they agreed. And they thought that, okay, so as soon as the Brits leave, we're going to have people like that, these Hindu fanatics that are going to rule over us. We're not going to have anyone who's going to be able to protect us, and they're going to trample us. Which, I don't know, I mean, maybe if you look at modern India, they're right. But, so this was the fear. So Churchill wanted to, and he also had a concern for the untouchables, the lowest caste of the Hindus. And so they, not even the caste, the people that are even below the lowest caste, and how they would be treated. He had a very great disdain for middle-class Hindu intellectualism.
Yes,
he said,
I noticed this as well.
He said
you'd be abandoning the country to the middle class intellectuals, basically.
The middle class. What he said, he said, well, one moment they'll be quoting John Locke to you, and the next moment they'll be sort of I don't know, kicking an untouchable in the streets.
Yes.
And so his point was that, well, look, if we leave the middle class Hindu intellectuals to take over the country, the Muslims and the untouchables are going to be totally trampled. And our duty as an empire is to make sure that this does not happen. First of all, because he believed in the Whiggish values, but second of all, the empire had been there.
That's an interesting phrase, though, the duty, right? Because that reminds me of Curzon's line. Was it Curzon or was it Milner? I think it could have been Milner, actually, on the People's Budget, that it is our duty to oppose this budget. But now it's gone full circle, where Churchill is the one who's seeing it as the duty to oppose this thing, which looks and sounds nice on paper, but Churchill here is the one thinking through the consequences of what you're unfolding. And he does. I think you're absolutely right. I'm in complete agreement on this. I don't know if he was surrounded by the milieu of these the Oxford educated Indians, right? And that, he seems that maybe the Bangalore days are coming back into his head as well. Also, he's thinking about, he'd seen fanaticism. This is where I like Roberts, because he's bold enough to go there. He said he had seen fanaticism with the Mahdi rebellion in the Sudan, which we touched upon
in the Sudan, and he also saw it in India.
Exactly, but most people would go, he saw it in Sudan and then he saw it in Hitler, right? But Roberts will actually also say, and he saw it in Gandhi, and go there.
Yeah,
which I think is good. It's honest and it's brave, and as Roberts says,
no.
Gandhi only became a secular saint after his assassination in 1948. What happens in that 48 moment is, think about what had happened to Kitchener, right? When Kitchener goes and dies in 1916, he becomes the war hero. When Gandhi gets assassinated in 48, that's the mythos is cemented. But Churchill, speaking in 1931, is just seeing the asceticism. Yeah, carry on.
Christopher Hitchens said that his view was that the element, I suppose you wouldn't even, at this point, he was such a force that you wouldn't even call him an individual person, but the element of Gandhi in the whole the whole independence wrangle of the first half of the 20th century in India was what led to the disaster of partition and the violence and everything like that. It was the fanaticism, the asceticism, the insane, the pacifism, the celibacy, the fanatical celibacy. All of these things were just totally poisoned the potential of a united India, which may have been. I think the British could have had a very respectable withdrawal from the country, and if they hadn't given it dominion status and the process hadn't started whereby the Muslims were just alienated, and then you led to the whole the 1947 situation.
So I think it's a good place to wrap up. I found the quote that he gave to the Royal Albert Hall to the Indian Empire Society. Quote, "To abandon India to the rule of the Brahmins would be an act of cruel and wicked negligence. It would shame forever those who bore its guilt. These Brahmins who mouth and patter the principles of Western liberalism and pose as philosophic and democratic politicians are the same Brahmins who deny the primary rights of existence to nearly 60 millions of their own fellow countrymen, whom they call untouchable, and whom they have, by thousands of years of oppression, actually taught to accept this sad position. And then in a moment they turn round and begin chopping logic with John Stuart Mill, or pleading the rights of man with Jean-Jacques Rousseau." And so we're into March 1931 there. And by July 1931, a financial crisis will cause a deepening of the Great Depression and end Ramsay MacDonald's purely Labour government, and a new coalition government enters. And I think that's a good point to leave it.
Well, in fairness, to present the opposite view, though I concur with Churchill, he's speaking about the Brahmins. In fairness, them, and a number of their countrymen might have said the same about the British, but in their country. But that's just an academic. I just wanted to present the other view.
Yes, well, of course, the other view is there, but you're a man of your own destiny, and that's what this talk is about. Churchill's sense of destiny. He has always had, I will defend the empire. It's the Indian Empire Society he's speaking to there. Again, the oratory, he knows his audience, and all of that is getting mixed in. Of course, the other view is the dominant view. You see in discourse today. You won't hear many people standing up to a speech made to the Indian Empire Society. No,
you won't. The empire was at that, whether it was good or bad for the country in the broader historical perspective, at that point, once it had already the empire had been imposed, since 1856 or whenever it was, and before that, since 1756 with the East India Company, it was a necessary force, and the way that Britain, in the throes of this, the death throes, the imperial death throes, and in the panic of the post-imperial age, it wasn't even really the post-imperial age, the post-imperial age, the interwar period, they decided to do this. I think it was they just disgracefully handled it. I mean, Churchill was absolutely right on this matter. But the reason that I presented the other view was not just to present the other view, was because the exact words of Churchill about the Brahmins could be applied to the British in the exact same way. But anyhow, that's all. That's my view on the matter. Yeah.
Yes, and we leave him there in the 30s, a Victorian mindset in the throes of a dying empire in modernity. So we'll pick it up in the next one. Wilderness years. And of course, then he'll be called back in for the hour and the decision. Till then, guys. That's it.
All right. Goodbye.